In late April and early May of 1945, the war in Europe was beginning to wind down. Much of Nazi Germany was already under Allied control, as well as the territories they had conquered. Germans were surrendering en masse to the Western Allies whenever possible because they knew that to fight on would mean almost certain death. To surrender to the Soviets was a guaranteed trip to the Gulag-style prisoner of war camp where you might well be worked to death and treated with extreme prejudice in the meantime. Those still fighting were largely units of the Heer, or the German army, who had not yet had the opportunity to surrender, or else the more fanatical units like the Waffen-SS, who had vowed to fight until the death and never surrender. In today's fascinating episode, we're going to explore the two documented times that Wehrmacht units and prisoners they had held fought against the Waffen-SS alongside American troops to whom they would later surrender after the battle. Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Me, Myself, and I History, where weird history and strange happenings in the universe are always on the menu. My name is Seraphim. Before we begin today, I want to make a quick note on the use of terms here. In the English-speaking world, we use the German term Wehrmacht to mean the German army in World War II. The term actually includes the Kriegsmarine, or Navy, the Luftwaffe, or the Air Force, and the Heer, or Army, as a whole. Today's stories center on the Heer, with a touch of Luftwaffe thrown in. These stories more or less tell themselves, so without further introductions, let's begin. Our first story today has its origins in the mid-16th century during the reign of the Habsburg dynasty. In 1565, a writing school began in Vienna. Today we know the school as the Spanische Hofreitschule, or the Spanish Writing School. In 1729, Emperor Karl VI, famous for uniting both Habsburg's lines, that of Spain and Austria, into a single dynasty, had commissioned an architect to build the famous Winter Riding School building that has been used by the riding school ever since. In the late 1580s, a rare and highly prized breed of horses started with 8 studs and 35 mares. Some sources say 9 studs and 24 mares. This breed was the exclusive domain of the Habsburgs until 1916. It is the exclusive breed used by the Spanish riding school to this day, the Lipizzaner. Lipizzaner stallions are world famous for their traditional dressage and performances of exacting maneuvers and jumps. After the Anschluss in 1938, the horses came under the control of the Nazis. The Nazi ideology about an ideal Aryan race extended past humans to some animals, apparently. An Aryan man needed a worthy steed to ride, and the Lipizzaner breeding stock at the Pieper Federal Stud Farm were thought to be the perfect basis for this mythical Aryan horse breed. Due to air raids on Austria in 1942, the herd was removed to the somewhat safer protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, modern-day Czechia or Czech Republic, near a town called Hostau, today known as Hostun. The breeding program began with the fact that Germany was still using 180,000 horses and donkeys in military service in 1938. Hitler believed even more were needed, and that they needed to be superior in quality to all other horses. His generals agreed with him. Let's face it, no one who wanted to remain alive and free would disagree with Hitler, but I digress. Hitler chose the renowned hippologist Gustav Rau to head up the program. Rau immediately turned to the Lipizzaners and believed that he could create the perfect breed through selective inbreeding of the best stock in the herd in just 3 years. Rau appears not to have understood the deleterious effects of inbreeding. It might magnify the best qualities, it might also magnify the worst, or even trigger double recessive genetic conditions in the horses. At Hostau, veterinarian and reluctant Nazi officer Oberst Rudolf Lessing was put in charge of the breeding program. Another Oberst by the name of Rudowski was in command of the farm. As it became increasingly apparent to even the most dedicated of the Wehrmacht itself that Germany was going to lose the war, Germans began to surrender en masse to the Western Allies whenever and wherever they could. The alternatives were death or surrender to the feared Soviets. In order to do so, one had to be not only near the front lines of one of the Allied positions, but one had to run the gamut of Waffen-SS or Gestapo personnel, or the few remaining Heer units still determined to fight to the end. On 28 April 1945, General Patton's Third Army was just 20 miles or 32 kilometers west of Hostau. The Soviet Red Army was just 40 miles, or 64 kilometers to the east. Both were fighting to get to Prague first, even though the Yalta Conference had determined that Czechoslovakia would be in the Soviet sphere of influence. Pinned between the two allies was the Nazi breeding farm. Most of the mares there had only recently given birth to their foals or were about to deliver them. Also, there was the command of the Luftwaffe intelligence officer, Oberst Walter Holters, who had recently been waylaid after running out of fuel for his vehicles. Holters was eager to surrender to the Western Allies. As an officer of der Luftwaffe, he knew that there was almost no Luftwaffe left, and any position held by the Axis could be easily bombed into oblivion by Allied air power if ground forces didn't beat them to it. Although seeing the futility of continuing the war, Rudovsky was also cognizant of his oath to the fatherland. He was not keen to be seen as a traitor to his country, even if he knew it was defeated in all but formalities. There was simply no ability to continue the war much longer. The Heer and the SS were both nearly out of fuel, out of ammo, out of troops, and in most cases out of any will to continue the fight. What Holters and Rudovsky had in common was a deep love of horses, and these Lipizaners in particular. The advancing Soviet forces would take any serviceable horse for their own use and slaughter the rest for food or just to prevent the Germans from using them. These Lipizaners were rare and highly valuable. They had also recently been made even more rare as the Royal Hungarian Lipizaner herd had been slaughtered by the Soviets as they occupied Hungary. This showed in no uncertain terms that the Lipizaners were in grave danger. Neither of these German colonels wanted to see this breed wiped out. The only option was to see them into the hands of the Americans. While Holters was busy convincing Rudovsky of the need to trade a mass surrender in exchange for protecting the horses, he had already sent a courier in the person of Oberst Lessing to the American lines with the offer. They raised a white flag and approached the 42nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron under the command of Colonel Charles M. Reed. Reed was, fortuitously, a polo-playing Virginian who had served in the horse-mounted cavalry in World War I. There was no better officer to have made contact with. Reed was delighted in the plan of action that he and Lessing came up with. They contacted Oberst Rudovsky, who agreed to the plan and the surrender after it was carried out. General Patton gave a green light to the plan and said make it fast. Not only did the cavalry under Reed have to penetrate 20 miles of enemy-held territory and make it back, he had to do it before the Soviets arrived. Patton had no orders to go past the German-Czechoslovak border. Because of a shortage of resources for an unplanned mission, only 2 cavalry reconnaissance squadrons and a few minor armor units were authorized for the mission. It was the military equivalent of a shoestring budget. It was dubbed Operation Cowboy, and the task force was codenamed Task Force Andrews. An artillery barrage blasted an opening through the German forward defenses, but the whole stretch of the route was contested. By a miracle of divine providence, Task Force Andrews reached their goal. Now the task of retrieving the horses and withdrawing would be the hard part. Reed did not have nearly enough men to do the job, and he needed transports for the pregnant and newly foaled horses. While Reed separated in order to obtain the vehicles, command was handed over to his subordinate, Captain Thomas M. Stewart. Stewart formed a ragtag group of Allied POWs. Poles, French, British, New Zealanders, and Serbs all eagerly volunteering to help. He enlisted some staunchly anti-communist Cossacks commanded by Prince Amasau, who joined the German cause, hoping to free their homeland from Soviet rule. They were lifelong horsemen and were soon rearmed and remounted. They would serve as herders as well as soldiers that day. Finally, some of the Heer soldiers who had no love of Nazism were rearmed in exchange for a pledge to surrender to Reed's command and return with him to Allied lines. They were eager for the opportunity. Their final battle and a chance to live had finally come. This ragtag motley formation was quickly dubbed Stewart's Foreign Legion. Word soon arrived that SS units were approaching with orders to kill the Americans and the horses. Stewart's Foreign Legion squared off with the formation from the crack SS Regiment Deutschland. It is fortunate for Stewart's men that the SS had no armor support. A few Americans died and a similar number were wounded. In a lull in the battle, Reed organized the loading of pregnant mares and new foals. Another attempt was made by the SS, but they lost that attempt as well. Over 100 Waffen-SS men lost their lives in the battle. The remainder of the horses were herded Old West roundup style, guided by American, German, and Cossack officers riding some of the horses. Just as the herd was preparing to move, the first Soviet T-34 tanks arrived at the edge of hostile. There was a tense standoff for a brief time until the Soviets decided not to interfere with the operation and allowed the U.S. command and its prisoners to leave with the horses. The horses were herded into the American lines and protected for the duration of the war, and eventually returned to the Spanish riding school in the mid-1950s. The descendants of these horses continue to perform to this very day. "147 miles, or 237 kilometers away in Tyrol, Austria, lies the village of Iter. The village would be unremarkable except for the presence of Castle Iter. Although fortresses and castles have been built and maintained on the site since at least AD 1241 and probably going back to the 10th century. The present structure was built on the location in the 19th century. Originally belonging to the Prince-Bishops of Regensburg, it became the administrative seat of the Counts of Ortenburg. The Archbishops of Salzburg later made incursions against it. Finally, in 1380, the Regensburg bishops sold the territory to the Archbishop of Salzburg. In the final act of the Congress of Vienna in 1816, Iter became a crown land of the Empire of Austria. The present foundation was begun in 1878. Franz Liszt, Arthur Rubinstein, and Pyotr Tchaikovsky all stayed at the castle at various times. Tchaikovsky even orchestrated one of his compositions there in 1892. In 1940, 2 years after the Anschluss, the owner of the castle, Franz Grenner, leased the castle to the German government. On 7 February 1943, the castle was seized from Grenner by SS Obergruppenführer Oswald Pohl, acting on orders from Heinrich Himmler. On 25 April of that year, the castle was placed under the administration of the Dachau concentration camp. It was used to incarcerate high-value French prisoners. Among its notable prisoners were former Prime Ministers Edouard Daladier and Paul Renaud. French generals Maurice Gamelin and Maxime Weygand were also held here. Other politicians, diplomats, and influential socialites were also housed at the facility. Eastern European prisoners detached from the main Dachau facilities were used for maintenance and general labor. One of those laborers was Yugoslavian communist Zvonimir Chuchkovic, who left on 3 May 1945 on a pretense of conducting some business or other for the prison commandant, Sebastian Wimmer. Because the local village down the mountain was still occupied by German forces, Chuchkovic turned up the Inn-River Valley toward Innsbruck, 40 miles or 64 kilometers away. There he encountered the 409th Infantry Regiment, 103rd Infantry Division of the U.S. 6th Corps. He quickly informed the Allies of the high-value prisoners in the castle, and a heavily armored rescue column was formed. It was recalled after heavy German shelling. Meanwhile, on 4 May, Wimmer, noting that the former Dachau commander had died in suspicious circumstances on 2 May, and that on 3 May Chuchkovic had disappeared, feared for his own life and abandoned his post. The SS Death's Head Guard soon followed, and the prisoners took over the castle and armed themselves with the few abandoned weapons that they found. In Vögel, the village 5 miles or 8 kilometers down the mountain, most of the Heer troops occupying the town had abandoned it, but it was quickly reoccupied by SS troops in the area. The Czech cook of Castle Iter, Andreas Krobot, volunteered to bicycle to Vögel to seek help. He was taken to Major Josef Sepp Gongel, the commander of the Heer soldiers who had refused the retreat order and had thrown in with the Austrian resistance. Gongel had hoped to surrender to the 409th when they arrived, but now he would have to wait for other units to approach the area. A short time later, Gongel got his wish. Just 8 miles, or 13 kilometers to the north, in the village of Kufstein, a reconnaissance unit from the 23rd Tank Battalion, 12th Armored Division of the 21st Corps stopped in the town square, waiting for relief by the 36th Infantry Division. Gongel got a message to First Lieutenant Jack Lee, the commander of the tank detachment. Lee heartily agreed, and quickly had permission from headquarters. He told HQ that the castle's thick walls would likely let them hold off any but the most determined of attackers with only a small detachment. After a reconnaissance of the castle and the area, 2 tanks were left, and Lee requisitioned 5 more tanks and some infantry from the 146th Infantry Regiment of the 36th Infantry Division. The bridge they had to cross proved too flimsy, and the requisitions were ordered to return with 1 tank ordered to guard the bridge. Lee set off with Gongol, 10 former Heer artillerymen, and 14 additional soldiers to make their way to the castle. 4 miles or 6 kilometers from the castle, they defeated a detachment of SS troops attempting to set up a roadblock. At the castle, the prisoners had befriended SS Hauptsturmführer Kurt Siegfried Schrader, who had been convalescing from his wounds. They convinced him to defect and asked him to take charge of their defenses. Schrader brought his family inside the castle to protect them as well. Soon, Lee arrived with his meager reinforcements. The former prisoners cheered, but were quickly disappointed with the small size. The reinforcements were positioned around the castle with Lee's own tank named Besotten Jenny right at the entrance. The resistance leader in Vogel was called and reinforcements were requested, but only 2 Heer soldiers and a teenage boy could be spared. They joined the small force as quickly as they could drive up the mountain. A high-ranking and highly decorated SS officer, Oberführer Georg Bockmann, along with somewhere between 100 and 150 SS troops, had been occupying hills in the area. Seeing the small ragtag force that included traitors to the fatherland, he decided to attack the castle. Setting up machine gun nests and the infamous 88mm flak guns, he prepared to move. On the morning of 5 May, 2 days before the German surrender, Adolf Hitler was dead nearly a week. The German Wehrmacht was on the verge of collapse. The German Rump government under Admiral Karl Dönitz was already being formed in Hamburg, and Kassel-Iter was awakened by 88mm artillery strikes and machine gun strafing. Bricks dislodged in the artillery barrage injured Schrader's wife, who was quickly moved to inner rooms with her children. In the Besotten Jenny, only the radioman was on duty. He was trying to repair a faulty radio. He used a coaxial machine gun to return fire against the SS troops until it was knocked out by an 88mm artillery strike. Although out of commission, the armor of the Sherman tank protected the radioman, who escaped unharmed. Seeing their plight increasingly tight over the course of the day and radio communications cut off, Lee accepted the offer of tennis star Jean Barotra to leap the walls and attempt to run past SS lines with a message for the 142nd Infantry Brigade. Barotra made it past German lines. He was quickly recognized by René Lévesque, the future Premier of Quebec, who was then embedded as a reporter for the Canadian press. Barotra asked for an American uniform and joined the relief force as it moved against the besiegers at Kassel-Iter. Arriving about 1600 hours, or 4 p.m. if you prefer the 12-hour clock, the besiegers were quickly defeated and taken prisoner. The French former POWs were evacuated to France that evening and arrived in Paris 5 days later on 10 May. And there you have it, folks, the story of the 2 times Wehrmacht troops fought alongside American troops to defeat Waffen-SS troops in World War II's closing days. Oh, and lest I forget Schrader, one SS officer too. These are 2 of the more unexpected stories of that cruel war, and a short moment of true heroism for those who had fought for the losing side before giving up the fight. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit those like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to hit the notification icon to be informed of more content from this channel, and then tell your family and friends who like weird history. Until next time, my friends, this is Seraphim with Me, Myself, and I History signing off.